Well, friends, I'm so grateful to see you here today. So I think we're about to start. You see that our audience starts discovering this webinar. Will go live at 10 o'clock. And so why don't we just use this couple of minutes when everybody is settling into just a few reminders about the second day of the Climate Change Education Solutions Summit at Grand Valley. So welcome back. I hope everybody had a good time yesterday at the first day of the CCESS in person. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to remind you that today's event is entirely virtual. So if you are here with us right now, you already know how to find the link. If you are searching for the links for the other webinars today, they're all posted at www.gvsu.edu CCS. And even if you are not registered for the program, you can still find those links on the website. My name is Elena Rubimtseva. I'm a professor of geography at Grand Valley State University and one of the founders of the CCESS. And today we are featuring 3 webinars and 2 documentaries. In a couple of minutes, we will start with our keynote webinar on racial capitalism, climate change, COVID-19, and public health. Immediately after that, at 11 o'clock, we will shift to community presentations on climate change, and just please be mindful to switch to the second webinar link. Again, please follow us either in the program that was sent to all registered participants, or you can just go to the website and find those links there. After the lunch break at 2 o'clock, there will be a statewide discussion, collaboration towards climate action on Michigan campuses, joined by colleagues from 7 universities across Michigan. And then at 3 p.m., there will be documentary streaming of Great Lakes, One Water for Life. This is a 2022 documentary by Zygmunt Kazicki and Stephanie Bayasi from the Great Lakes Environmental Festival. Some of you had an opportunity to talk with them yesterday and learn a little bit more about their work. And then at 4 p.m., we will be showing Grand Valley documentary, Climate CISO. This will be the second version. We have reworked it since the premiere on campus in April. And this is, of course, the work of Christine Davis, Leah Anderson, and myself about impacts of climate change on Michigan North. So with this, I would like to introduce our first webinar today, our keynote, and we'll pass the screen to my colleague and friend, Brian Deyo.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm really excited to be with John Biewen, the Director of Storytelling and Public Engagement at Duke University's Keenan Institute for Ethics, and Dr. Whitney Laster-Pirtle, Associate Professor of Sociology at University of California, Merced, and also a GVSU alum. It really is an honor, a pleasure to have you with us for this special conversation on racial capitalism, climate change, and COVID-19. Just a brief description of this webinar or this keynote interview. This keynote conversation examines the history of racial capitalism since 1492, focusing on its more contemporary manifestations in the context of climate change and COVID-19, with a special emphasis on its implications for democracy and public health. So I wanted to start off by talking about 2 important concepts. And the first concept that I have in mind is neoliberalism. And it's a concept that I have become familiar with over the past several years. I've learned much more about it through John's 2-time Peabody nominated podcast series, Seen on Radio. And I've shared segments of his podcast series with my students. And I find that it's a very effective way of mainstreaming these very, very important concepts that help us, I think, to understand how it is we got to where we are right now, and to also think about the solutions moving forward. And so not a lot of people in the United States seem to know quite a lot about the concept of neoliberalism. And my wife, she teaches in the Spanish department here at GVSU. She's from Mexico. And I also teach courses in Latin American literature. And if you're from Latin America, you know about neoliberalism. You know it's about its effects. But interestingly, here in the United States, well, curiously, I might say, we don't seem to know a whole lot about it. And so, John, I was wondering, you were familiar with an elevator pitch. Since we're relatively short on time, can you give us a quick elevator lecture on neoliberalism?
Sure, and it's good to be with you both this morning. Thanks, Brian. This is maybe if we have about a 2-minute elevator ride, I'll make an attempt at this. And this is based on I'm not a scholar, I'm not an expert on really anything except maybe making audio documentaries, but based on the work that I've done on democracy and also white supremacy and trying to understand the dynamics that explain where we are. I've managed to talk to some leading thinkers on neoliberalism, and my understanding basically is it's a political philosophy that favors free market economics, so less government regulation of the economy, certainly, and small government in general. And related to that, as the name implies, in liberalism, we're talking small L, classical liberalism, which, the John Locke version, not the, Bernie Sanders version. Which for
distinction, yeah.
Right. And for many neoliberals, we're talking libertarianism, meaning an emphasis and often almost a fetish about individual liberty, right? The right to not be told what to do. So this manifests itself in kind of extreme versions as, how dare you tell me I can't own a weapon of war, or even that I have to register it? How dare you tell me I have to wear a mask or get vaccinated for the benefit of the other people, and the broader community? So individual liberty at the expense of, the common good is how I would put it, frankly. And then the additional thing to add, which is not everybody who talks about neoliberalism includes this aspect, but this comes from Wendy Brown, the UC Berkeley political theorist, who's written a lot about neoliberalism, and it's based on her careful study of its earliest and most influential thinkers, people like Friedrich von Hayek and James Buchanan. And that is the notion of traditional morality. And these are things that, I think we'd often associate with politically conservative people or certain parts of the right wing. But she thinks of this as an important part of neoliberalism. And meaning by traditional morality, religion, patriotism, the family and its traditional structures, so including patriarchy. And you might say that this is consistent with a certain kind of comfort with other traditional hierarchies, including white supremacy. And I would just say, we can look around at the attitudes and policy positions of people who promote neoliberal policies, and you might see some correlation there. So I guess that's what I would say on the elevator.
Yeah, excellent. So Whitney, so I want to ask you about the concept of racial capitalism. You have done extensive work on the concept of racial capitalism and applied it to the healthcare system, inequities in the healthcare system, and COVID-19. Can you do what John just did and give us a quick elevator lecture on the concept of racial capitalism?
Sure. And again, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I wish sometimes I was back in Michigan, but I'm happy to Zoom in virtually. So I came to learn about racial capitalism through engaging more deeply with Black radical thought traditions. And what I've learned is that the concept comes out of these sort of thinkers, both in the US and South Africa and global communities all over, that were trying to think about how capital accumulation had been expanding, but how it is tied to the idea of race, racialization, and racism. So it was further deepened by a theorist named Cedric Robinson, who wrote a book in 1983 called Black Marxism. And in general, the racial capitalism as a concept is the idea that capital accumulation is based on racial exploitation, and that you cannot really see these two systems as distinct, that they are linked together. So twin systems that sort of divide and conquer allow some people to thrive and some people to really struggle to survive. To quote Robinson, he said, the development, organization, and expansion of a capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. So too did the social ideology. So this theory says that racial capitalism created the modern world system through slavery, colonialism, and genocide. In the United States, clearly slavery as an institution shaped how we might think about racial capitalism today. The idea that that human beings were sought as only for their labor and not really to have any human value. And that allowed some to accumulate a lot and some to have a historical legacy of disadvantage and dispossession. I think it connects well to the idea of neoliberalism in many ways, in that even if we aren't necessarily seeing slave or caste systems in the same way, we still see, mass deprivation for some groups. Incarceration regimes have been linked to racial capitalism. The COVID-19 pandemic, that we saw, really distinct disparities across race and other class statuses. Two scholars that I've been engaging with that are sort of thinking about this now say, this is Andy Clarno and Hadir Eid, write, the neoliberalization of racial capitalism has entrenched the inequality created by centuries of colonization and apartheid. Race remains a driving force of both exploitation and abandonment, despite the liberal veneer of legal equality. So that it can still, even though we have freed some markets in a way, that it doesn't sort of map on to the freedom for everybody to accumulate in the same ways.
This idea that neoliberalism works to reproduce racial hierarchy, right? Yeah. So I think this sort of naturally leads into my next question, which is for John. Thank you, Whitney. So John, do you think that it's fair to say that neoliberalism as a theory, as a set of policies, and also a system that structures society, as well as its relations with the natural world, is inherently racist or white supremacist, even ecocidal, anti-democratic? Why or why not?
Okay, I guess what
That's a big question. Yeah.
I think I might kind of skirt past the inherently part, because I think that's a difficult one. But what I would say is, in its effects, pragmatically speaking, right? And because at the very least, what neoliberalism does is that it says, hands off the world as it is, basically. And we have, in fact, and this is an important part of when I talked about the aspect that Wendy Brown emphasizes of the emphasis on traditional morality. It's like what people like Friedrich Hayek said was the reason the way that he tied together market economics and traditional morality was that he had this notion that these were things that had sort of, in a kind of Darwinian sense, had been developed over a lot of time, and that there was an inherent wisdom in these things because they had sort of won the battle of the cultural battle right? And had been the chosen, selected ways of being in the world for communities, and we should leave them alone. We shouldn't mess with them. And it's arrogant and wrong to think that. And of course, I think he very badly, he leaves out power dynamics out of the whole story. It's like it somehow evolved naturally that white men had all the money and the power, and so we should leave it alone. Well, so and the other thing is, and Whitney alluded to this a little bit, but there's the way in which racial capitalism obviously talks about the initial, what Marx called the primitive accumulation, which is originally when the Dutch and the Brits, created the East India companies and basically just went out and killed people and stole stuff and then colonized and built a bunch of wealth that way, which they then used to build factories to create more wealth, right? And so the whole system was built on exploitation of people who were racially other. It was absolutely central to the story of how the West and the capitalist countries got rich, and inseparable from it. But it didn't end there, right? Like it continued. And one of the things that we did in the Seeing White series that I made on Scene on Radio is we had an episode called White Affirmative Action that looked at, over the last couple of centuries, just in the US, you talked about the Homestead Act, you talk about the GI Bill, talk about home mortgages that came out of the New Deal, and how Black people through redlining were excluded from that billions and billions of dollars in wealth that was handed to the middle class through the ability to get a home mortgage. And then just all the ways in which, through segregation and racism and exclusion in housing and employment and on, that this system has continued. Olufemi Taiwo, the Georgetown philosopher, he uses the phrase global racial empire, which I think he means something
a striking phrase,
racial capitalism.
Yeah.
This is a quote from him. The aqueducts that contain and discipline the continuous motion of the past into the future were laid in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Wealth flows in one direction and pollution and its impact in the other, right? So we still have, and through the IMF and the World Bank and so on, with structural adjustments in the so-called developing world, where they force countries to to basically set themselves up in neoliberal fashion so that they can be good participants in the capitalist system that ultimately really serves the West. And it's still siphoning wealth out of Africa and parts of Asia and South America and so on. And that's why I think when you say that, folks in Latin America know what neoliberalism is, because it's discussed more there. So to the extent that neoliberalism says, let's not fix any of this, it's okay, let's back off, let's not have any government intervention to right this ship or to right these wrongs, it leaves that system in place. And so absolutely, the results are white supremacist, racist, and yes, I would say ecocidal, for the same reason that if we're not going to take a strong hand to do what we need to do, just in the most simple terms, which is stop burning fossil fuels as quickly as humanly possible. The results are ecocidal.
Thanks very much. So this question is for both John and Whitney. Another quick elevator lecture, if you will. And so the question is, I'm just wondering how the question is, how can we achieve a broad and deep societal understanding of neoliberalism and racial capitalism? And also, how can our understanding of these two important concepts, help us to collectively imagine the kinds of change or cultural transformation necessitated by the facts of anthropogenic climate change, as you understand them, and the likelihood of more pandemics or spillover events during our lifetime?
Yeah, that's another great and big question. I will take a stab at answering it. And I think part of my answer will address the last question a bit too. Just because I think you asked, how can we better understand these terms, I think right now, and then what can we do about them in a sense? And I do think that sometimes understanding the idea of racial capitalism, especially in our neoliberal time, can be difficult, but when you break down those concepts, I think it can become clear. So, as a sociologist, one of the things we teach is that race is a social construction. It's related to our identities. It's not alone really attached to the idea of a hierarchy, but that's where sort of the system of racism comes into play, and that supports these hierarchies. And so if there are racialized hierarchies, that means that the groups that we deem as like most valuable have greater access to resources and goods, which means capital and decisions about capital and how those things are made and distributed. And groups at the bottom are not. And so, some people will ask, as you sort of did, is capitalism or neoliberalism like inherently, or as we've seen it, racist? We actually have a lot of evidence to suggest that it is, just because of the ways we have constructed these hierarchies and how they manifest and are replicated in sort of all of the social institutions that we face in society. And so I think, when we talk about terms like white privilege, we think about that as almost social psychological, but also what privileges do you have? How is whiteness, how has it been constructed as more valuable? When I'm teaching this to students, it's like, and as my instructor at Grand Valley taught me as a student, when we can even go back to the dictionary and like, what is whiteness? It is like clean and pure. And what is blackness? It is dirty and dark and evil. And so these ideas sort of, they are racialized, they become ideologies, but they have tangible effects for what we can do as groups and what we have access to. And so that's how you get, residential segregation or disparity across economic outcomes, income. Economic is really broad. So let's, educational outcomes, even within the same job, people are paid differently. So it's the idea that these are so closely related because they are co-constructed, that when the idea of race as we know it globally now, but especially in the United States, came about, it was because it was tied to particular ideas of value. And what we value most here is like material goods in a capitalist system. And so racial capitalism is so ingrained and important in shaping sort of all of these outcomes. So I think that, trying to get an understanding of those things can be difficult because some people might want to focus just on capitalism, that everybody has like a unifying experience with capital like accumulation and how maybe we might be confronting that it is bad. But if we can't really stop there, that it hasn't harmed all groups the same and it has been racialized. And so I think, in my area of looking at health, I think the COVID-19 pandemic made that a good case to explore. So if you remember, like early 2020, when the rates of COVID-19 were getting shared in public media, there was some rhetoric that, despite your color or your nationality, we're all at risk. We're all in this together. We need this sort of collective support because you never know. And there are, that was a very unifying experience. But when we got into the data much more, we saw that there were huge gaps by race and ethnicity in the United States, but in Brazil and in all these countries that are, especially the countries that are highly racialized, that have more inequities. And so what we saw is that basically in a system that is highly inequitable, this sort of crisis, a health crisis or a climate crisis, is only going to exacerbate those pre-existing inequities. because we have, you know, systems that have oppressed, especially poor people of color, more. And so if they are lacking resources to health, to stay healthy in the pandemic, it's like access to masks, or the fact that you might have to go out and work, or, you know, vaccines. But if we're talking about things that we've experienced in California, let's say fire, who has the ability to shelter in place, who has fire insurance, who was more likely to go fight the fires? They were actually incarcerated individuals who aren't getting paid for their labor. So, you know what I'm saying? It's just that we don't really reconcile with the inequities that are, you know, at the core of how we have structured the United States, that we will continue to see. Sorry, an alarm is going on. We will continue to see these inequities sort of expand and become heightened and more problematic with each sort of crisis that we are facing.
Yeah, Brian, when you asked that question, and I can't remember the phrase exactly, but how do we mainstream, how do we, you know, get these ideas more widely understood? One thing,
and also, if I could just say really quickly, you know, I guess the question I'm asking is, how is a deep and broad societal understanding of these two important concepts related to you know, the possibility of a cultural transformation, right? So we can get away from valuing, you know, capital accumulation, you know, so that money and economic rationality is the arbiter of all value. And we can start thinking about leading with altruism and compassion and all these sort of natural sort of instincts that we carry within ourselves as human beings, but also that you know, we have this ideological overlay that often inhibits us from actually expressing those traits that are so essential to our survival and our flourishing.
Yeah, you're talking about a pretty profound cultural shift. Some would say transformation. That you know, there are people who argue that's happening, that 50 years from now we might be in a very different place, whether because things have collapsed, which is entirely possible, and so that we will have had to learn our lesson the very, very hard way, or that, you know, they're continuing. I'm researching and starting to write the next series on Scene on Radio, the next full series, which is about capitalism, and again, really sort of going back and telling that story, and also exploring, well, what alternatives do we have? What does a different economic system look like that actually serves the people and other living things instead of the other way around, right? Which is now, and one of the things that has been striking to me is that I've researched, you know, I sort of started looking into who is thinking about these things, the actually huge number of people who are working on everything from medium-sized, you know, reforms to really profound and radical transformations of the way we live in the world, and that absolutely having to include, if not start with, our economic system, the way we organize our whole system of getting the stuff that we need and sharing or not, and so on. But so we have this 2,000-year history that goes back to, you know, the Roman Empire and the Crusades and the age of colonialism and the age of capitalism, and, you know, in which the West in particular built a whole culture of exploitation and thingification, as the poet Aimé Césaire put it, right, where you treat first women and then people who are born in a different part of the world and have a different skin color, and then also the natural world, as things, objects to be exploited for personal gain. And what is it going to take to see that is not just, you know, immoral, but it's actually suicidal? So then, yeah, this is where I was going to go, is that this question of how do you get there? And one frustration I have is, you know, I worked in public radio for a long time. I'm a media maker. and the frustration with our media system. I'm not going to call it an ecosystem. It's not, there's very little eco about it. But where you have these notions of neutrality and objectivity. So we're just gonna, we're gonna sort of take the status quo as a given. And there are people who think about these things oftentimes who say, actually, in fact, that objectivity is the posture in support of the status quo, as it's usually sort of practiced and understood. So objectivity meaning I'm going to kind of be in the middle and take a neutral stance, and I'm sort of describe that how the people on this side and this side, as opposed to actually telling the truth when it's sitting in front of you, right? So and then the tendency, the fact that actually that you have a right wing, very aggressive media system. And I just came across this yesterday, and I was so struck by it, and it's relevant, I think, to our conversation. Mark Andreessen, who's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist guy, billionaire, I think, and he somebody found a document that he was sharing among people, and he's talking about the enemy. And I'm reading this, these are his words. Our enemies are not bad people, but rather bad ideas. And then he includes in this list of enemy ideas things like sustainability, ESG, social responsibility, stakeholder capitalism, meaning that you care about things other than just the bottom line, degrowth, the limits of growth. These are enemy ideas that these weird people over here on the crazy communist left are talking about, and we need to shut them down. Of course, CRT was another one that got this treatment, right? We're going to treat this as alien, sick thinking. And so we have that whole system. And I think those of us who actually would like to argue that these things are going to preserve life and make life better are maybe not so good at that kind of ideological warfare. So that's a frustration too.
Yeah. Great. We have about 10 minutes here, and I think just enough time. I have two more questions. So this is for either John or Whitney. So you both work at universities, and you're both educators, and you also have engaged thoughtfully and critically with the American healthcare system. And so a question I have is this: do you have any ideas about how our healthcare systems can team up and collaborate with institutions of higher education to expedite societal understanding of the structural logics of neoliberal political economy and racial capitalism, as well as their implications for public health and in a democratic sort of way? Another sort of thick question, but there you go.
Yeah. I mean, I love working at institutes of higher education because we have the opportunity to think about these questions and ask these questions and engage, minds of any ages on these sorts of things. I don't know. It's an interesting question, especially in this moment where we are seeing conversations about what curriculum should be taught. Usually that is within K-12 classrooms, but you can look at, my colleagues at, for instance, in the University of Florida, who have had to change titles of their classes, so they can't teach critical race theory, but they can teach about, a sociology of racism, those sort of things. And that in some ways our ideas might be spreading, but also that there is this sort of pushback against what that might look like. That is scary, and that there are book bans and libraries across the nation, and that libraries are closing because they're losing funding. Like, all of these things are sort of connected. And so I do think it is an important call for any educator or person who wants to be educated to think about what they even have access to and how they might, learn and engage and spread that knowledge. I think that in both institutions, or in all institutions, because they are all informed with ideologies that I think we have at a societal level, like John was talking about, that they have been constructed in a way, or at least now, where we have one sort of idea of capital that really shapes people's experiences. So that's why we saw, for instance, the privatization of education and these, private institutions, especially online institutions, that research has shown that really went after poor people of color. That's why we have massive student debt right now. That, we are thinking that our folks in the United States do need to be educated. We do need to be, on the frontiers of science, but we haven't made that accessible. We've actually restricted that. And the same thing, like the number one way that people become in debt besides student loans and housing is healthcare, right? Mm-hmm. So that where do we value public health, which really means public well-being, how our ability to live like healthy, that is highly tied to markets and really related to insurance. And it's not necessarily doctors, but it's the system that connects all of these things together that is, again, saying that we need to focus on capital as in material versus other forms of capital, like John is saying, that what would it look like if we thought of capital as some countries, maybe how healthy we are, or the metric that is really, I think, important to study in health, maternal and infant health, that is supposed to, like the moment some infant is born, that's supposed to be sort of a clean slate. And if that is an indicator of overall health in a nation, that the United States is failing poorly. Like we spend the most money on healthcare, research development, but have some of the worst health outcomes. I think that shows us that it's not working, but we still haven't had this sort of cultural transformation there. And so I think that in any sort of institution we're looking at going from healthcare to higher education, it really must be confronted with the cultural transformation that ties into our ideology of what we're valuing. How do we get there? It's hard. When I was in school, we had the 99%? One, like a protest against, the 1%.
Yeah, the 99%, yeah.
Yeah. Now we're really dealing with abolition, the ideas of abolition. And I think that's really exciting. And I do think abolition is broader than a lot of the ways we've been thinking about it. I'm a sociologist who we consider the grandfather of American sociology is W.E.B. Du Bois. And he wrote in a century ago about the idea of abolition democracy. So again, thinking about how we might abolish the ways our democracy is existing. And his main question was, if slavery was so integral to how we have set up democracy and we get rid of one institution, slavery, does those political ideologies and economic sort of constructions, how do those remain, right? Yeah. And so I think we confront those same questions today, not focusing on slavery, but these other sort of unequal systems. Like, how can we have abolition democracy in a neoliberal time, I think is a really big question.
Yeah, so we have one question from the audience, and we're got a couple minutes left here, and I wanted to ask this question. I think it dovetails rather nicely with the conversation thus far. So one of our guests asks, do you have a substitute system for the current failing one? How will the change happen? Organically, planned, managed? Will it be timely before the multiple crises become unsolvable? And it immediately occurred to me, you were talking about, I think in season 5 of Señorita, the repair, about the ways that GDP is assessed. And I forget the name of your interlocutor, but I think he was talking about economics. He was economics that is devoted towards not GDP in the traditional sense, but an economics that is devoted to the well-being of all, including the planet.
Right. So you're thinking of Christian Felber and the economy of common good, but there are lots of versions of this, right? And there are people who talk about regenerative economics, donut economics, which is Kate Rayworth. I won't get into explain that right now, but basically lots of people thinking about models that have to do with shifting incentives at the very least, right? Shifting a system that, so the economy for the common good, Christian Felber's an Austrian guy who's written this book, and he's written a bunch of books, but thought about this, which is basically you would remove there, you wouldn't be able to make money from money. You wouldn't be able to just invest money and draw it out. Only people who work for an organization would be paid. Actually, for the Capitalism series that I'm working on, I went to Mondragon, which is a remarkable, it's the world's largest kind of federation of worker-owned cooperatives in the Basque country of Spain, 70 or 80,000 workers at a whole array of companies. They're all owned just by the workers, right? So that's one model, so that you're just removing the whole thing where people are just, siphoning money off of capital accumulation in the old phrase for its own sake. But various other kinds of ways of thinking about systems that serve people and other living things, to put it in the most simple terms possible, and that you set up a system where that's required, basically. And that systems that, and organizations that don't do that and that are doing harm in the world, you just don't allow them to exist. You have laws and regulations and structures that don't allow it. So how do you get there? Yeah, I think that's a much longer conversation. But it's probably going to it's either going to happen because we completely go over the cliff, as we are in the process of doing right now, in my opinion, or because enough people get the right, and we need leadership. We need leadership in every institution to try to tie up quickly from your question about, healthcare, education, media, politics. We need people, we need to elevate people who understand these things and can actually move them forward instead of dragging their feet or trying to take us 180 degrees in the wrong direction.
Okay, great. This is just wonderful. One last question. Just yesterday, in fact, I didn't get good sleep last night. There was a terrible bombing of a hospital in Gaza, killing innocent healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, men, women, and children. I think unfortunately and tragically, we're seeing a preview of what the world might look like if we don't get serious about mobilizing and thinking very seriously about how to collectively transform our culture and also our social, political, and economic systems. We live in very dark and difficult times, and sometimes it can be absolutely overwhelming and paralyzing and debilitating. And so my last question is, what gives you hope? Or joy? What keeps you inspired? What sustains you and gives you the necessary courage to persist and to continue your work, both in higher education and in the world, especially during this difficult moment?
Yeah, this is, thank you for this question. I think it's a good question for everybody to ask of themselves when the world feels like it's too much. And, I think there's a few different things that give me hope, especially in moments like this, that I think are, have been really difficult. And I will say, I think I've mentioned terms like genocide, apartheid, all of those things are part of the conversation that's happening right now. And so it's a good moment to reflect and see how, even if it's in a case that has been deemed as complicated, how those systems still interact to shape, some people's, ability to thrive in moments like these, and the, greater chances that other people are going to die. That's unequal. And that's something we can all sort of recognize. I personally find a lot of hope through protests, that, I remember protesting on campus at Grand Valley when Prop 2 happened when I was an undergrad there. And, students protest on the University of California's campuses all the time. And it's never fun to be the person folks are protesting. But I think that is, if we have instructed or cultivated minds in a way that they feel to protest, I think we're doing something right. That consensus usually hasn't been productive because we do have unequal systems. And so we need folks who are saying, well, what else? What can be done differently? How can we, make this sort of argument have resonance, even if the media is not covering it in the same way? Attending protests, there's always things you can protest. Pipelines, water in Flint, like there's all sorts of things, right? But I think I've found a lot of solidarities through protests, conversations with groups maybe I wouldn't have interacted with, and I can see that we're coming together for a common shared goal for us, which I find a lot of hope from. Also in these moments, thinking from COVID-19 to moments of war, I think that mutual aid, so how folks have come together to create ways to support that are unlike the ways we have normally done, is really exciting because it offers a moment to think of how we could do differently. So in COVID-19, that we weren't getting maybe N95 masks distributed widely, but then you had like aunts and grandmas and young children learning to sew together to distribute masks. And so the sort of community connectedness that comes out of moments, and we can say, oh, wow, what if we had more support and resources for those sort of things on the ground? How might our overall public or community health in this particular community look differently? And so I think in these moments, they're very difficult, but if we can pause and think about where the intervening is happening, whether it's like being through a protest, through a strike, through a mutual support, you see these moments of hope, which I think is a practice within the idea of abolition. As Mariame Kaba has said, it's a hope is a discipline that we have to hold on to with each step in order to sort of get to this new transformation that some of us really want.
Wonderful answer, Whitney.
I appreciate all of what you just said, Whitney, and in a similar spirit to me, actually, what gives me hope is this conversation, and I mean that, not just in the kind of touchy-feely way, but the fact that this conference is happening at GVSU, and that, Brian, you decide, okay, we're going to do this conversation as part of it. And that's representative of actually stuff that's happening, right? And there's been a lot, and I've engaged in some kind of pessimistic talk as part of this conversation about how hard it is to get the word out and whatever. But actually, these ideas are spreading. And we've talked about the backlash, the book bans, the fights over how history is taught, the backlash to critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if there's a backlash, there's something that the folks are lashing back at, and that is this sort of bubbling up of understanding of these ideas. So when you have Tucker Carlson going on, when he was on Fox News, and I'm sure he still does this every day, about it's okay to be white. Why is he saying that? 15 years ago, he wasn't saying that because he didn't need to. Well, now he thinks he needs to because he's hearing this stuff about white supremacy and whiteness, and that is bubbling into the culture. So an abolitionism, as Whitney says, just the fact that more people have heard that word and are using it, this stuff actually is happening. So I think it's just, we don't know. We've been in this situation. I feel like 35 years ago, we were asking, about the nuclear war, which is what we were worried about then. Will we kind of get our act together before there's this sort of race versus people who want to heal the world and stop the violence against the people who are trying to advance the violence, and that race is kind of always underway, and so we don't know. But I think there's plenty to be hopeful about. It's just whether we'll get there in time.
Whitney, John, Brian, many thanks for sharing your insights today. It was just such a great privilege to witness your conversation and have an opportunity to record it. So thank you all. Really great webinar. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic day.
Thanks, John and Whitney, Elena. A real pleasure and an honor, and I look forward to working with you and collaborating with you and seeing you again in the future. Take care.